Okay, so we're going to talk about least restrictive environment. And least restrictive environment, as we know, is the principle that requires schools to educate students with disabilities with students without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate. There are many reasons for a least restrictive environment. One of those is that there is a long history of segregating students with disabilities from students who do not have disabilities. Another reason is so that students with disabilities have the same opportunities or equal opportunity to achieve and full participation in independent living and economic self-sufficiency, so that they must participate alongside of persons without disabilities. And the third reason also is to have equal opportunity, but also in the area of developing relationships. So the law does favor inclusion, and it requires that school districts educate a student with disability alongside of students with disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate, which we already said. But it also says that you may not remove the child with a disability from the regular education environment unless the nature of the disability is so severe that the child cannot benefit even after the school has tried using supplementary aids and services in the gen ed setting. So the law still has the continuum of placements and services, with the least restrictive being general education and the most restrictive being a residential school. So we have all these placements that we must offer, and we can certainly mix them, so to say. So a child could be in a resource room for part of the time in gen education setting for part of the day as well. In Pennsylvania, Chapter 14 regulations define a variety of placements that are available to the students, such as itinerant special ed, resource room, part-time or full-time special ed. And these definitions are limited to classrooms alone, but are essentially portable, and again may be provided in any number of locations. So in terms of the laws, the court cases that helped us to shape least restrictive environment, one of the most famous is the Oberti versus Board of Education in our Third Circuit. If you remember from one of the first weeks, the Third Circuit encompasses New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And the Third Circuit Court in the Oberti case helped us to define least restrictive environment and told us that when you determine whether or not a child can be educated satisfactorily with aids and services, we must consider if reasonable efforts have been made to accommodate this child, if the child does benefit, but we also have to look at whether or not there are any negative effects on including this child on other children in the classroom. So these are important factors to consider. Importantly, the regulations prohibit a child with a disability from being removed from their age-appropriate class solely because the child may need modifications or supplementary aids and services. So I'm not going to go through all of these court cases, but essentially we have really important court cases that have spoke to least restrictive environment. And if you just look down the list, you see that they're all circuit level, at least 4 out of the 5 are circuit level court cases, meaning they're high level courts directly under the Supreme Court. And so we have throughout the late 80s into the 90s, we have the courts ruling on least restrictive environment issues. And many of these cases looked at the benefits of the placement, whether regular or special education. They looked at such things as whether or not supplementary aids and services were tried. They looked at, if the child made benefits, again in either setting, but also whether or not the child impacted other children in the classroom. So they give us what's called tests or prongs that help us to decide on LRE. So these are important cases to look at. And then here I tried to select some Pennsylvania decisions, which you can find on the web, other than the Third Circuit one, which TR was a New Jersey case. But the remainder are Pennsylvania, and you can find some of these also began as due process hearings, so you can find some information about them on the Office for Dispute Resolution website. So in conclusion, in the last couple of slides, we address private schools and charter schools. And private schools still, even though we're not talking about least restricted environment, we did say previously that the child is entitled to FAPE, and that then there are only limited obligations required by the local education agency when it comes to servicing children in private schools. And that deals with equitable participation. So children enrolled in private schools by their parents are afforded equitable participation in terms of some services, particularly those related services, child find, and consultation between the private school and the local education agency. And so that essentially talks about what I just said, but this slide deals with, whether or not there's a complaint between the private school and the local education agency. And in terms of charter schools are considered, in a way, considered public schools. They have to abide by the same laws that our state regulations abide by, which is the federal special education law. And so that takes us through least restrictive environment.